right? The US has a desire to get to 10% by 2030, right? The US set a desire for 3 billion gallons of SAF by 2030. And we were sitting at 14 million gallons last year. So we've got 6 years, right, to figure out how we get from 14 million gallons to 3 billion gallons in the US.
Welcome to Leaders on a Mission. I'm your host, Simon Leach, and today we're joined by Jimmy Samartzis, CEO of LanzaJet, a pioneer in sustainable aviation fuel. Now, as the world grapples with carbon emissions, we're really asking the tough question. Is sustainable aviation fuel really the game changer it promises to be? Or are there hidden downsides we need to understand? With Jimmy today, we're going to dive into how LanzaJet is transforming raw materials into cleaner jet fuel. And we'll understand the challenges of scaling production and whether sustainable aviation fuel can really meet aviation industry's demands. So join us for an insightful conversation on the future of sustainable flight. And Jimmy, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me, Simon. I'm grateful to have the chance to have this discussion with you.
Awesome. Now, you've had a really interesting, you've not had a linear kind of career trajectory, actually. And, I thought maybe you could just share a little bit, I suppose, about your career journey. I suppose with context around understanding what inspired you to work at LanzaJet.
Yeah, sounds good. It's, I'm one that actually oftentimes talks about not fitting in a box. And I've never been a guy that fits in a box. And I think most organizations think about boxes as having very concrete sort of guardrails around a role, for example. But I've never been that guy really throughout my career. So it's sort of kind of fitting for me to be in this role in leading LanzaJet as the CEO. Just to give you some context, I've been in the industry of renewable fuels and sustainable aviation fuels in particular since 2008. I was with United Airlines at the time, and we were really an early mover in terms of helping the industry understand what the opportunity is to create drop-in jet fuel from something other than crude oil, which is what we've been doing for 80 plus years. So I've been doing this since 2008, but I think it's helpful to kind of go a little bit further back. My career spans about 30 years at this point. And I think what's interesting, and for me at least, as I do some self-reflection about where that motivation comes from to sort of spend a career focused on sustainability and sort of solving some tough issues, probably goes back to when I was a teenager. And it's some people may chuckle at the fact that I'm going back to when I was a teenager, but I was in high school and I helped start up our high school's environmental awareness club. And this was when I was 15 years old, at a time when I thought we could do more in terms of sharing understanding of environmental challenges and what we could do even within a high school as students. And back then it was all about recycling aluminum cans and being less wasteful, if you will. And if you think about that today, it's really no different, right? What are the opportunities for us as a society to be less wasteful? What can we do in aviation to not pull net new carbon molecules out of the ground? So as I, sort of pursued my career coming out of college, everything I did ended up starting with an opportunity for me to play a role in an environmental project or a climate-related project. And my career started in politics. At first, I spent some time working at the White House, and then transitioned from there to the private sector, working in strategy and management consulting. And every sort of step I took in my career, there was always a desire to have a mission focus to what I did, what the projects were that I was involved with, and what I sort of desired to do from a career perspective. Fast forward to 2008, when I ended up at United Airlines, it was a great opportunity for me coming into a strategy role at the airline, realizing that we had an opportunity within the industry and certainly within the airline. When you think about what was happening in the economy in 2008, when crude oil was spiking in terms of a price per barrel, we saw it as a way for us at the airline to say, how can we do this differently? How can we address and potentially hedge some of the cost impacts of crude oil or fossil-based fuel on our business? And that gave me the permission to start to think about how can we do this differently. And back then it was really early days for the airline industry to think about sustainability from a fuels perspective. What was happening at the same time was you had carbon taxation schemes popping up around the world. The EU wanting to tax carbon and other schemes from other countries. So really it was a confluence of a desire to sort of address the cost impact of fossil jet fuel, the desire to sort of address carbon taxation that was popping up in this disjointed kind of way across the globe, and really created an opening for us to figure out how do we do this differently and how do we help align the industry on how to decarbonize the sector instead of letting governments sort of step in and do it in an uncoordinated kind of way.
Got it. So the dialogue really changed from initially it being about kind of the hedging and the pricing and the economic kind of aspects into a much more kind of planet sustainability kind of journey, as it were. And what was the thing that kind of led that kind of transition, as it were?
Yeah, I think it's at a company like United and at an industry level. You have to have some leaders who are champions of it in order to sort of see a swell of change happen. Within the company, I was supported by a CEO that was forward-leaning and sort of believed in the fact that the airline had a very strong sense of corporate responsibility, climate being one of those things. So I found alignment and support with, if you will, my CEO. We also had at our board level a public responsibility committee that also had alignment to that as well. So from a leadership perspective, you had the support that I needed to move things forward. And then globally, we started seeing, and we sort of pushed for this, which was how do we bring airlines together to address this in a unified way? And that's when we started to work together as a group of airlines, and as the airplane and engine manufacturers came in as well. And we started to then work with the United Nations to develop a global approach to how to manage aviation emissions. And that led to some fantastic work on getting the industry to agree to decarbonize by 2050. So this net zero ambition by 2050 for the industry is very real. It's one that is supported by all the airlines, the manufacturers of the aircraft and the engines, the airports. So we really brought an entire industry together, which was the first time, I think, especially at the UN sort of global level, to align on how to do something, right? Which is rare. And especially when you think about the United Nations, you have 190 plus countries that are agreeing to it. So it's the industry bringing a plan forward. It's the countries that then have to agree to it. And then those countries individually have to hold their stakeholders accountable. So we sort of, leveraged the inertia that we started developing to take it to a global level and to get the United Nations to agree on a way to decarbonize aviation. And as part of that strategy, sustainable aviation fuels became a sort of the anchor, if you will, for how the sector is looking to decarbonize.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And great example of an industry coming together. As you said, there's not so many, examples of that, when you look at history. But look, we'll explore a little bit further, but going into a startup with everything that you did, whether it be in the strategy consulting and, all the way through in policy, all of a sudden, you're leading a startup. So, very different environment, different set of challenges. So, we'll explore that a little bit further later in the conversation. What I want to kind of jump into a little bit with LanzaJet really is just let's just chat through what you guys do and the problems that you solve, as it were.
Yeah, and so I'll go back a little bit to what I was sort of shaping, which was the industry has agreed to decarbonize. The question then becomes, how do you do that? The industry sees a few different levers that we have. We can improve the efficiency of new aircraft, right? So, the Boeings and the Airbuses and the Bombardiers of the world, if you will, are all developing and improving aircraft so that they fly more efficiently. That has an important impact on reducing carbon emissions. When you think about operating flights more efficiently, that was work with air traffic controllers and the airliners to sort of fly a little differently, which has an improvement. There are carbon offsets that airlines can buy. Questionable in some cases in terms of the validity and the quality of some of those carbon offsets. But the thing that airlines have anchored to, and I think, broad agreement that 65% of the overall decarbonization solution is sustainable aviation fuel. So the thing that I just stress over and over again with people when we're talking about this is the fossil fuel industry has been developing jet fuel made from crude oil for the last 80 plus years. So what that means is we're pulling carbon out of the ground in order to make a product above ground. And the key for us has been, as an industry, not just LanzaJet, I'll get into LanzaJet here in a little bit, but how do you do that without pulling carbon molecules out of the ground? Use what's already above ground. And how do you do that in a way where it can be a drop-in fuel so that you're not replacing aircraft engines or infrastructure at the airports? You're using what's already here. That is hard. That is really hard to do, right? So how do you come up with a brand new technology that can do what industry's been doing for 80 years? And we're sort of looking at a condensed time horizon to do this differently today. And that's where, I've, throughout my SAF career, if you will, since 2008, I've played around with all the technologies. There are, pathways, as we call them, that have been approved for use in commercial aviation. One of those pathways that started started this whole thing was called HEFA, hydroprocessed esters and fatty acids. That technology uses used cooking oil, animal fat, or tallow, as we call it, as the feedstock. But from a technology perspective, very similar to what traditional refiners are used to, right? They're used to taking an oil and cracking it, right, breaking it down into different products that it gives you. What we do at LanzaJet is completely novel. It's not starting with an oil. It's taking carbon that's above ground, transitioning it into ethanol, and from ethanol making it into SAF. So it's more of a chemical process where you're taking a molecule and building it up, as opposed to starting with an oil and breaking it down, I guess is one way to think about it. The beautiful part about this is we can use nearly any waste material available above ground. So we can use things like municipal solid waste and convert that to ethanol. We can take forestry and ag residues, convert that to ethanol. We can take carbon monoxide from industrial steel mills, convert that to ethanol. We can take CO2 directly out of the atmosphere, convert that to ethanol. And we do all of that in partnership with LanzaTech, which is an independent company from us. They do that part. They take the waste and convert it to ethanol. We step in and we can take that ethanol and make it into your sustainable aviation fuel and renewable diesel, the only two products that we produce. The other really neat thing about our technology at LanzaJet is you're not feedstock constrained. I just mentioned a lot of opportunity to take waste materials and make it into ethanol. We also have, in today's global market, more than 30 billion gallons of ethanol that is already being used in transportation. It's being used in road transportation. Ethanol gets blended into gasoline today. So there's lots of availability of feedstock that we can access today, as well as build those, the pipeline, if you will, for ethanol made from waste sources. So it's a tremendous opportunity for us to take, it's a novel technology, a novel way of doing this, taking waste material that's available above ground, taking waste carbon, if you will, recycling carbon, and making it into a drop-in fuel that meets, the full set of criteria that you need for commercial aviation.
Got it. Amazing. Now, tell me, is it carbon neutral then? Sustainable aviation fuel production.
Yeah, it's a good question. We think about the carbon on a life cycle basis. So it has to be viewed from, what does it take from, the raw material to the finished product to create that fuel. Inevitably, the airline has to burn, fuel, and it produces emissions. The question is, on a life cycle basis, how do you reduce that emissions? By the very fact of not pulling new carbon out of the ground, and you're using carbon already existing, you have an improvement. The different feedstocks give you a different, what we call carbon intensity in the finished product. If you're starting with something like a municipal solid waste, then you can end up with a product that can be, net zero, if you will, and in some cases, carbon negative products, because we have a way to get to ethanol that also, there's a technology we work with that produces a biochar. That biochar goes back to the soil, so you get credit, if you will, for returning that carbon back to the soil. So you can, by and large, there's a range in terms of what that final product can be. At a minimum, if you look across the global landscape, what governments want you to do is call it at least a 50% reduction compared to fossil fuel.
Got it. Great. Tell me the process then when you have the ethanol, I suppose, and you're then converting it into jet fuel. Is that a complex process to do that in a kind of, to do that aspect of it?
Yeah, it's I describe it as 4 simple steps, but when you look at our plant, which is in Georgia, you look at it and you're like, oh my gosh, like the number of pipes and vessels and equipment and how this all works. It's incredible physics and chemistry at the end of the day that sort of transforms a molecule into a more energy dense molecule. That's the sort of the magic in all of this. The process for us is a lot of chemistry, really, in terms of taking an ethanol molecule, we convert it into an ethylene molecule by taking water out, and then we start to build the carbon chains that you want for the fuels that we produce. We've developed the world's first commercial scale plant that uses alcohol to jet technology. So taking a first of a kind technology that's novel, right? It's the first time we're not using oil to produce a fuel, deploying that and then building the world's first plant and then operating the world's first plant, right? All of those are amazing firsts for our company, but also importantly for the industry, right? This is over the course of my 16 years in the renewable fuels industry, I've seen many technologies that have failed, right? And getting to a place where the technology works, that is super important, right? Because the technology has to anchor the success of building this industry. What I mean by that is, a lot of discussion with governments around policy, the policy support that's required, a lot of discussion with financiers on the capital that's required to build this industry, a lot of interest from airlines on the demand signals they're sending that says, we want to use this fuel. All of that is great. If we don't have technology that can actually produce a fuel, we're in trouble, right? And that's why the technology piece of this is so important. Very difficult, super complex. Lots have failed in trying with other technologies to do this. We're a great, I think, success story of, we've been on a 14-year development journey for the technology through all the different stages and are at a place today where we're showing the world you can have technology that works as we continue to build that ecosystem, right? As we continue to get governments to support with policy, airlines to show demand, financiers to support the capital that's required to build out this infrastructure. So our view, and my view in particular, is there's a role for LanzaJet to play and for me to play and for our team to play, not just in the technology of what we do at LanzaJet, but how do we actually do this across the industry? How do we build the ecosystem? What partnerships do you need to be successful at building out the entirety of the value chain, if you will, so that we can see an industry that actually takes hold and that is producing fuel that is less carbon intensive than what you have today with fossil jet fuel.
Yeah, no, got it. It sounds like you've been really busy over the last few years. And, let's just highlight a couple of the key milestones as you look at the journey, as it were, because you've mentioned you've got a facility up and running in Georgia. It'd be great to talk through some of that.
Yeah, let's start with when we started LanzaJet, because I think it's important to sort of help people understand. We started LanzaJet in May of 2020. And if you think back to that time, this was at the peak of COVID. Our world was shutting down. Airlines weren't traveling. Airlines weren't flying, right? Countries had sort of...
Price of oil collapsed as well, right? It was nothing, wasn't it? It was literally trading, options were trading at minus.
Yeah, no, exactly right. So you had macroeconomics at play that honestly caused, many to probably question, what are you doing spinning out of LanzaTech, a sustainable fuels company? right? It requires an airline industry to be healthy and operating. It requires your product to be competitive as much as you can with a fossil equivalent. So a lot of dynamics at play, but that is when we started the company. And we started the company with, great supporters, investors, with companies like Mitsui out of Japan, one of Japan's largest conglomerates, Suncor Energy out of Canada, so a traditional sort of fossil energy company. British Airways joined us, and then Shell Oil joined us shortly thereafter. That sort of, and LanzaTech continued, right, obviously to be involved with us since we spun out the technology from them. But that was a time when most were probably skeptical. We were able to build a team that was committed to building this company together. And you started to see there, you had a commodities trader with oil companies, with airlines doing it together, right? And that sense of partnership is an important thread that is vital to who we are and sort of how we behave. So fast forward a little bit, right? We had technology, we had to build the first commercial plant. We had plans for it. And then with COVID again, construction costs skyrocketed, labor became constrained. We had a real issue, which was the cost of what we expected that plant to be were now very different. And our pockets as LanzaJet were frankly not very deep, right? We had planned for costs of a project pre-COVID, and then we're dealing with the reality of cost of a project, if you will, during COVID and post-COVID. That really required us to, think very creatively. How do you find the capital in that market with what was going on in the economy, what was going on in global supply chain to do this? And pulling on that thread of partnership, we ended up finding fantastic partners. Microsoft came in and supported us through their Climate Innovation Fund with a loan to support the development and the construction of the project in Georgia. We had Bill Gates's Breakthrough Energy come in and give us a grant for $50 million. I'd give the comparison. If we didn't get that grant from Breakthrough Energy and we had to fund it through a debt instrument, the cost on a per gallon basis for us would have likely been 80 cents or more per gallon higher cost, right? The fact that we got a grant for that amount of money made the product that we're producing that much cheaper, which is super important when it's a first of a kind technology and a first of a kind product when you're trying to build a new industry. So, partnerships for us have always been very, very important. Working with governments has been very important because we believe that governments have an important role to play in building a new industry. So fast forward a little bit, we have the groundbreaking of our plant in Georgia. We brought together.
But when was this? When did you break ground?
Yeah, so this was December of 2022. And then that then enabled us to start the construction on site. And then in January of 2024, we celebrated the grand opening of the facility in Georgia, right, which was the world's first alcohol-to-jet commercial-scale SAF plant. For me, a moment in my career when you sort of take a step back and you realize what it takes to do that and to get there. For me, it's been a journey of 16 years of developing partnerships and relationships to help us build the industry and to develop this company. That event for us was as much a celebration about LanzaJet and that milestone for LanzaJet as it was really for the industry. It was a celebration for the industry. We brought together 400 leaders from across the globe to celebrate that as a milestone. Right? Think about that as a first time that we have a technology that is not using oil to create a fuel, with a novel approach to doing it using ethanol, right? So super important milestone for us, for me personally, for the team, for the industry, a great celebration. And we had people there from, Kazakhstan to Japan to Brazil, the UK, across Europe, a phenomenal event. And then, fast forward to where we are today, right? So we have that plant we've been going through commissioning and startup and bringing that plant to an operational state, where we've been doing a great job at that. We're, dealing with issues that typically come along with starting up a new refinery, a new plant. Nothing unusual, which is good news. It just sort of takes time to work your way through all those steps in the process. At the same time, we've seen our business and interest in LanzaJet and our technology expand across the globe. We now have customers that we're working with in 26 countries, ranging from national oil companies, oil majors, to project developers, right? Those who have a strong interest in just developing a SAF business. So talk about as well, alongside that, an evolution for how do you build a company from nothing? I was employee one to having now a global footprint of an employee base that's executing important work, in so many countries. So it's been quite the journey, right? But a very rewarding one, not without its obstacles and all of its challenges. And I think a bit of a testament to who we are as a company, right? We take the punches, if you will. We kind of roll with it. We overcome those challenges. We find innovative, creative solutions to get over those challenges, and we push harder, right? We don't let back. We sort of find ways to let that energize us and help us get to that conclusion that we really want.
I think if you're dealing with setting this business up during COVID and dealing with some of the kind of challenges off the bat, probably stands you in good stead from a resilience kind of viewpoint, isn't it? Right?
Well said.
Yeah.
Well said.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's tremendous. Tell us a little bit about, when it comes to your scale in this facility, what do you hope to be able to kind of bring online and to be able to kind of produce in terms of metrics and volume?
Yeah, so this facility in Georgia is 10 million gallons a year of sustainable fuels, both sustainable aviation fuel and renewable diesel. Those are the two products that we produce. Just to give you some context, so in the US last year, there were only about 14 million gallons of SAF produced. And extrapolate that globally, you probably had about 150 plus million gallons globally that were produced last year. So the opportunity for us is to contribute pretty significantly, if you will, to the volume of SAF in the US. You have some new HEFA plants also coming online in the US this year. So you should see some good volume of SAF coming into the market. But let's talk about the context for, what's the denominator, if you will. In the US pre-COVID, and we're back to those levels now, US commercial aviation consumes about 21 billion gallons of fossil jet fuel a year. Globally, commercial aviation consumes about 100 billion gallons.
That's an incredible figure, 100 billion gallons.
Gallons of fossil jet fuel.
Yeah. So
put that into context. Whether it's the global metric I gave you or the US metric, SAF production last year was 0.05% of overall jet fuel demand. And let's then talk about aviation has a desire to be net zero by 2050 and different countries have different goals by 2030, 2035, 2040, and so on. Some countries have goals to get to 10% by 2030, right? The US has a desire to get to 10% by 2030, right? The US set a desire for 3 billion gallons of SAF by 2030. And we were sitting at 14 million gallons last year. So we've got 6 years, right, to figure out how we get from 14 million gallons to 3 billion gallons in the US. And it's the same calculus for Europe. It's the same for other countries as well. So the opportunity is huge, right? It's a huge opportunity for business, if you will, in terms of building up the capacity for the SAF industry. But challenged with how do you do that when technology has to work? You have to have ample feedstock to supply that. You have to have supportive governments to enable a new industry. You got to have airlines willing to pay a bit more than fossil jet fuel, right? These are all dynamics that are very complex and that all need to happen at the right time in order for these businesses to find value to invest the billions of dollars required to build it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. How do you think that might? I mean, I suppose when I consider your business, right? There's an awful challenge for a startup to be bringing a facility and a plant on board and then building it and then operating it, right? You're not BP, right? How do you best leverage in the future the technology and the fact that you've kind of done this? Is this through, how do you really best bring this technology to scale so you can achieve those kind of figures by 2030?
Yeah, great question. So I would say it's a technology opportunity as well as a people opportunity, right? No one probably knows this better than you do in terms of the people component of a business like this. One thing that we did was we ended up building a phenomenal team of folks who have been there before in their respective functional expertise, if you will. What I mean by that is we hired in probably one of the world's best policy experts to lead our policy function, someone that is well respected across the globe on SAF policy. So he's very much the tip of the spear in the US and abroad on how to think about SAF policy. We brought on a leader who has worked for Chevron and Shell for 30 plus years building and then operating refineries, right? So you build that expertise. We don't have the time to sort of build that internally. We have to sort of acquire that and then, figure out how you create a well-oiled team working together, right? Coming from all these different backgrounds, all these different companies. So for me, that has been a big part of what I've doubled down on, which is building the team, building the right team with the right capability, making it work and function the way that it needs to, and then expanding, right? How do you expand capability and capacity to meet the moment? So we went from having, no employees to today we have, 150 plus employees. Not just in the US, but in Europe and in Australia, and we're expanding significantly. That, though, is not enough in and of itself, right? So it comes back to the partnership bit. So how do we leverage our relationships to help us? Our investors have been super helpful. So whether it's the LanzaTech, the Mitsui, the Shell, the Suncors of the world, extremely helpful to us. We created as well a partnership with a company called Technip Energies out of France. Yeah, they've got a footprint in 35 countries, 15,000 people. They're not only a technology partner because we use some of their technology in the A to J solution, but they're also an execution partner. So how do we leverage their footprint to help us execute engineering work globally? And then more recently, we expanded our investor base and brought on some additional phenomenal partners. We brought on Microsoft as an investor in the company, Airbus, Group ADP, which owns and operates airports around the world. And we brought on MUFG, Japan's largest bank, one of the largest project financiers in the world. When you think about then the complete set of investors that we have, it is the entire value chain, right? We've pieced together a set of investors that not only provided capital to us, but also help us in executing the things that we need to do in each part of that value chain. That's been part of our strategy. So it goes back to that anchor of partnership and building a new industry is extremely important. We've been doing that in how we execute, but also in the folks that we bring in close to us. Oh, sorry, I forgot to mention, and I don't know why I forgot this, but Southwest Airlines came on as our anchor funder during this latest raise. And just a word about Southwest, right? Phenomenal airline, super large airline. I think people don't realize how big they are. One of the largest here in the United States, and if you were to stack them on a global basis, one of the largest in the world. But they're also a lower cost carrier. And the fact that an airline like Southwest has an interest in SAF tells you a bit not only about their commitment, but also the value that they see in the opportunity with our technology and our company. The other interesting thing about Southwest is they've actually invested in technology to create a waste-based ethanol. So taking corn stover here in the US and converting that to ethanol. So that's an airline who's sort of not only wanting to buy SAF, but also making an investment in the companies that will help get them the product, right, of SAF.
Oh, no, awesome. That's great. Just a couple of quick things on that. When it comes to really achieving these goals by 2030, what was the figure in the US? Was it something like 12 billion or something?
3 billion gallons.
3 billion. You've built the facility in Georgia. Does this require brand new kind of new sites in order to house this technology in all cases, or can it be retrofitted with some of these larger partners that maybe have existing infrastructure?
Yes, so the answer is yes to both of those opportunities, right? On the one hand, the technology is different. So it's a different technology than refining technology, similar in some ways, right? So when you think about parts of our process where there's a hydrogenation step, refiners are very used to hydrogenation. They're also used to fractionation, which is part of what we do as well. Those things are very common. The opportunity with existing assets is how do we leverage the supporting infrastructure, the utilities, the tank farms, all that infrastructure is very expensive to build new, and an opportunity for us to spend less money deploying our technology adjacent to an existing asset that has all of that. The other opportunity for us, since we use ethanol, is how do you actually create a hub and spoke model where you take ethanol, which is usually smaller production facilities, and aggregate that to a much larger scale alcohol to jet unit. So a place like the United States is a great environment for us to think about a hub and spoke kind of model, where we can take ethanol coming in from multiple production sites of ethanol that feed a very large A to J unit. The economics, as you scale technology up, is much improved, right? So the goal here is to get to larger scale facilities to bring the price of the product down.
Got it. Yeah, absolutely. That was one thing I was going to just mention, as it relates to, how does the price compare to, normal jet fuel, kind of oil-based jet fuel?
Yeah, and I think that's where we're fortunate. I think the technology that we have lends itself well to having some of the most cost-efficient SAF production available in the market. So, as we scale the technology up to larger scales, the price comes down and is very close to being competitive with fossil jet fuel. There's probably a question in the industry of, whether you should be selling it at the price of fossil jet fuel, considering it has value that may be additive, right, to fossil jet fuel. But nonetheless, though, the opportunity is there for it to be very close to, parity with fossil jet fuel. Generally, across the industry today, you have, SAF that is typically people reference, 3 to 5x the price of fossil jet fuel. I think we're, even with our small plant in Georgia, we're much better than that sort of range. So it's just as you would find with any industry, right? The first plants that are being deployed, not just of our technology, of any technology, those gallons are going to be more expensive. That also is why you want government support coming in for those early projects. Not only does it help them become bankable, and it sort of brings additional capital to the table, but it actually helps to offset the cost of that, more expensive fuel, if you will, that is part of the equation in the early days, because these assets will be around for 30 years, right? So compared to then the third, fourth, fifth deployment of that technology, which inevitably becomes more efficient. It just always happens to work out that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And what do you think the challenge? I mean, you've covered a huge amount of ground. It sounds like in one way you've broken the back of it without really, you look at some of the goals and targets, it's all still ahead of you as well. What do you think are the real kind of challenges you face, when you look out the next kind of 3 to 5 years with things?
We talk oftentimes about sort of headwinds and tailwinds, and we like to sort of play into some of the language you find in aviation, but it's a bit of a tricky time right now in particular, because you have some companies with certain technologies that are having a hard time succeeding. When that happens in the industry, it sort of has a knock-on effect with other technologies and other companies that might be doing well. But it just creates some jitters, if you will, in the industry around supporting early stage technologies. So we need to sort of overcome this moment in time where you've had some setbacks in the industry with other technologies, not ours, right, but other technologies. So that's just a moment in time. We've seen this repeated over the course of history in my 16 years, but that's fine. You have elections that have happened and are happening whether it's here in the U.S. coming up later this year, or changes that have happened even in places like the UK, right, with a newer prime minister in place now and a new government, if you will. Those are moments in time that create some risk, right? We do depend on government to support building this industry, and when you have a change in government, it delays efforts that maybe were in motion, or in some cases there's a pivot in perspective, right, with new administrations. What we like to believe at LanzaJet, though, is that with our technology being ethanol to SAF, it's really neither a conservative issue or a progressive issue when you think about governments, right? It sort of cuts across. It's on the progressive side, perhaps it leans into the climate change believers, right, who want to see that effort move forward. But it also then lends itself to energy security, economic development, national security. And when I talk about our customers in 26 plus countries, they're not all doing it because they're altruistic from a climate perspective. I'd like to believe that we all tend to sort of believe that we need to do something different than what we've been doing in general as a society, but that's not always the case, right? Some countries see it as, we do work in Australia. Australia is a bit concerned about what's happening north of them and disruption of supply chains. They import all their fuel. How do we think about Australia taking its own domestic feedstock, creating and producing its own fuels within their country, instead of relying on other countries and supply chains that might be disrupted because of activity in Asia, for example? So for me, it sort of is we have that flexibility, right? We have the flexibility because it touches on so many issues that are important to governments, and there's a level of protection, if you will, in building the industry because of that. But that being said, when you need to get to 2030 ambitions, you need policy to support it. You need longevity in policy. Here in the U.S., people refer to the Inflation Reduction Act as being a good thing. It's a great thing. The challenge with it is it has a 5-year duration for SAF. So, by the time a company decides it's going to build a facility and then spends 3 to 4 years building that facility, you're out of runway with the policy. So how do we ensure that governments see this as, 5 years is certainly not enough. We need a 10-year duration on policy to support building an industry. Companies are making billion-dollar decisions or multi-billion-dollar decisions to do this. They need to ensure that there is that supportive environment, and policy and government, again, plays that important role. But again, so think about policy as being important to get us to 2030 and beyond. Technology absolutely has to anchor all of that, right? Airline demand is there. There's, airline after airline globally is saying, if there's SAF, we'll buy it, we'll use it. It has to be as close to, cost competitive with fossil jet fuel as possible. What helps it become cost competitive, again, is that government policy. How do you support the early production of SAF? So for me, I'm super optimistic. I'm sort of a optimistic realist is how I probably refer to myself, right? It's sort of, I know what it takes and the challenges of building this industry and building this company, but also optimistic that we can get there. So we'll get there. We'll get to 2030. We may not get to the volume production that countries want, but we will make a very good effort at getting closer to that. And then it's going to snowball, right? Once you have really great proof points of technologies being deployed, working and producing, and governments seeing that and wanting to support that, as you begin to de-risk it, it becomes, there's a level of inertia that sort of picks up as well. So right now, you're sort of facing risk across so many different dimensions of that ecosystem. It's challenging a bit, right? So we need to get past some of the risks in order for governments to be a bit more supportive, for the financiers to deploy capital, for costs to come down, and we will get there. I'm fully confident we will get there.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Jimmy, listen, it's been amazing. It's been a great conversation, and it's really clear that you're really advancing sustainable aviation fuel, but really paving the way for the future of those cleaner skies, as it were. So, So, yeah, listen, thanks so much for coming on. Loved chatting to you about this. And I think as LanzaJet continues to scale and evolve, their vision for a more sustainable aviation industry is really inspiring and necessary. So thanks for sharing your journey, really unique journey and perspectives. And to all our listeners, stay tuned for more conversations with leaders driving the future of sustainability. Thanks, Jimmy. It was awesome.
Thanks, Simon. Yeah, it was great to chat with you, and certainly appreciate it. Good to see you.
Yeah, really good to see you. I'll let you go. And yeah, thanks so much. I'll be in contact. I'll be back with a kind of launch date, and really look forward to bringing this out. And I really enjoyed the conversation with you.
Thanks, Simon. Good to see you. I appreciate it.
All the best. Take care.
Yeah.
Cheers. Bye.